distinguished speaker today is Professor Akeel Bilgrami. Professor Akeel Bilgrami was the chairperson of philosophy department from 1994 to 98. He was the director of Heyman Center for Humanities at Columbia University from 2004 to 2011 and director of South Asian Institute from 2013 to 2016. He is currently Sidney Morgenbesser Professor of Philosophy at Columbia University. I don't know whether I have pronounced those foreign names properly. His book, Secularism, Identity and Enchantment, was published by Harvard University Press in 2014. He is contracted to publish 2 small books in very near future. One called What is a Muslim? And Princeton University Press has agreed to publish this. And another on Gandhi's philosophy, situating Gandhi's thoughts in 17th century dissent in England and Europe, and more broadly within the radical enlightenment and the radical strand in the romantic tradition. Columbia University has agreed to publish this. He is also editor of the books Democratic Culture, which was published in 2011, Who's Afraid of Academic Freedom, with Jonathan Cole, published in 2014, Marx, Gandhi and Modernity, published in 2014, and Beyond the Secular West, 2016. Welcome, both of you. Friends, Professor Akeel Bilgrami was extremely kind enough and readily agreed to deliver this lecture. We had a long conversation of emails, etc. I really thank Professor Talat Ahmed as well as Akeel Bilgrami for being here with us. With this short introduction, there is a book launch program, a very short program. Babri Masjid 25 years on. 6th December was 25th anniversary of Babri Masjid. May I request Professor Talat Ahmed and Akeel Bilgrami sir? Either I. Friends, just 2 words about this book, very quick, because Vice Chancellor has to leave after speaking. Just very quick. This book has been edited by Samina Dalwai, Ramu Ramanathan. It is a collection of 15 essays which are based on memories of those who recalled, and we asked them to go into memories, what happened, how did they react at that time, what changed and what did they do. Along with the background, Professor Upendra Bakshi has written an excellent introduction into the whole memory, why and how memories are important, etc. etc. So the book is launched. It will be shortly available. We just got copies for release today. It will be shortly available, and it's being published by Gyan. With these few words, I hand over to
Yeah, just to add, our Vice Chancellor recently awarded a lifetime achievement award in New York for his achievement in SIG. So it's a very different development. For now, I request the Vice Chancellor, Professor Pradhan sir, to say a few words.
Good morning and Assalamu alaikum. Professor Bilgrami sahab, Irfan Engineer sahab, Nasir Raza sahab, my other colleagues, friends, students. This is a very welcome thing that the university is doing for the last 3 years, that we are holding Dr. Asghar Engineer Memorial Lecture, and scholars like Robila Kabal Saiba and now Professor Bilgrami is here. So this is a important academic activity that I feel is being done here, and this time the Arab Culture Center came forward to do this, and I see that we have very important people attending this meeting and the lecture by Professor Bilgrami. So I welcome you, Bilgrami sahab, to the university, and I welcome everybody to this talk, and I am sure that this will be very interesting talk, and people will be benefited. I have another meeting already lined up, so I have to leave. I have already taken excuse from Bilgrami sahab, but I will get the inputs from Nasir. And I thank Irfan sahab in particular that he has been coming to us, and we are holding this together, and we look forward to have this continues with the Jamia Millia and between your organization. So thank you so much, and I request Professor Bilgrami to give the talk.
It's a real honor to be giving this lecture in memory of Asghar Engineer, one of India's most distinguished and courageous public intellectuals and activists of the last half-century. I did not know him, though we had met on one occasion at a conference and snatched an afternoon to talk at some length, a conversation in which I was much instructed by him about the recurring communal riots in India, their common patterns, their regional divergences, and their deeper underlying causes. The meeting had a personal effect on me. I remember that I came away from it with the impression that only someone like him, and not me, could write about Muslims and Muslim politics in India effectively. His rootedness in his community, despite the notorious excommunication, his linguistic mastery of Arabic and Farsi, his long study of the Quran, all made him an authoritative voice, however heterodox and dissenting his views were considered to be in his own community. It is not that he made me feel like a déraciné, which by comparison I certainly am. It's just that I realized how important and privileged an utterance's location is. An utterance's location is. The same thing said by two people from two quite different locations, and I don't just mean geographical location, but the whole social and ideological context, can mean two quite different things, not just in terms of carrying conviction, but in terms of the meaning of the utterance itself. I had, of course, always known this, but that meeting brought what I knew only instinctively home to me in a way that amounted to a non-cancelable fact. It is this fact that has made me cease writing on Islam in the last decade or more. And though I've continued to write about secularism, these locational anxieties have arrested my desire to write about Islam and Muslims ever since my early article called What is a Muslim, which I had in fact written in one feverish night, the night of the fatwa, February 14, 1989, after an interview I gave on public television in New York. In our conversation, Asghar engineer had some shrewd things to say about that article, both by way of agreement and criticism with its main claims and argument. What I mean by the importance of location is obvious and can be easily illustrated in my own case. One reason for me, in my location of domicile in the metropolitan West, to be inhibited about writing about Islam in the critical and reformist way that in that essay, and as Asghar engineer had done much less academically, but much more extensively and powerfully and urgently in his writings, one reason to be inhibited about writing was this. After September 11th, 2001, there's been a Cold War against Islam in the West, and everyone has been demanding of Muslims living in the West that they be critical of Islam. To do so has become a career path for Muslims, and any self-respecting Muslim, however critical and reformist her views might be, should refuse to be careerist in this way, though it has not stopped writers like Fastari and Irshad Manji and others from doing so. And they have been lionized in that location for doing so. But that's precisely the lionization one should be shunning. Consider Sartre. He's constantly reviled for not having been critical of the Soviet Union. But now consider Sartre's location. Why on earth should he, in the location of Paris, in the context of a Cold War, where everyone is demanding he be critical of the Soviet Union, acquiesce to such a demand? He honorably refused to join Raymond Aron and others in doing so. Conversely, it is said that Sakharov was frequently upbraided in his location for criticizing his government, but not criticizing the terrible things that were happening in the United States, such as the racism and the inequalities there. And no doubt Sakharov had the same honorable reasons as Sartre for not doing so. And I've no doubt that if Sartre was located not in Paris, but in Moscow, in the context of an oppressive legacy of Stalin, he would have been eloquently critical of the Soviet Union. These are the compunctions that location bestow on one, and I can't help feeling, though I may be wrong, others here may know better than I do, that Asghar engineer was much more critical of Islam and his own Dawoodi Bohra community's practices when Hindutva was less pervasive here in our country. And there was less demand in the air that one shun Muslim beliefs and practices. And instead he began to focus more on his impassioned writing on secularism once Hindutva domination of our polity and society emerged in the late 80s onwards. In other words, the man we are commemorating in this lecture today understood very well that the duty of the intellectual was to be unpopular. And it's one's locational context that differentially determines which utterance is going to be unpopular. One among many reasons for his effectiveness, I've said, is that Asghar engineer's criticisms of Islam came from his grounding and commitments as a Muslim. It is very clear from his writings that he never ceased to be a Muslim, despite being considered by both his community and no doubt by other orthodoxies to be a very maverick one. And indeed, it is the Quran itself and his contextualist reading and interpretation of it that provided him with the critical resources of his own reformist claims. In fact, it was this enduring commitment that led him, for all his sympathy for free speech, to support the ban of Salman Rushdie's book, The Satanic Verses in India. So the first respect something with which he and I disagreed in that long conversation we had, at that conference. So the first respect in which I want to approach my subject of the limits of liberalism is to consider the fact that this steadfastness, this tenacity of commitment, is not something that liberalism, at least in its classical and official sense, can countenance without generating real tension within its framework. Why do I say this? Here I must turn to a brief scrutiny of liberal doctrine. Obviously, I can't do that in detail in a short lecture, but let me convey it to you by way of considering an argument for liberalism, for free speech in particular, by the most eminent liberal of the last half-century, John Rawls. In his rightly celebrated work, A Theory of Justice, Rawls pursues one overarching goal: to provide a contractualist method for each individual in a society to choose principles to live by, such that if one followed the method, one could not possibly arrive at a social contract with principles that were biased in one's own favor. So he wanted to present a method for choosing principles to live by in a social contract, such that if you followed that method, you could not, it would be impossible to choose principles that were biased in your own favor. This is what he meant when he called the principles of a social contract justice as fairness, that they can't be biased in your own favor. There were two such principles that he offered, the principle of liberty and the maximum principle, and I'm going to focus on the principle of liberty, of which liberty of speech and expression is the most primary. The method Rawls proposes is very well known, so let me give the briefest of expositions to make the point, his point. He proposes that when an individual contractor in a social contract chooses the principles for his society to live by, he or she must do so without any knowledge of the substantive values he or she has. Thus, if he is a Muslim, or a socialist, or a lover of cricket, he must simply be denied knowledge of those facts. To use Rawls's term, a veil of ignorance must be drawn over his own Islamic or socialist or cricketing values, and he must choose the principles to live by without knowing that he possesses those values. And Rawls claimed that the principle one chooses in this way could not possibly be principles that would be biased in one's own favor. And, moreover, he claims, one would, if one followed this method, choose what he calls the principle of liberty, most prominently free speech. To put it another way, each individual who enters a social contract via such a method is given the following instruction: choose only those principles that you would live by, no matter what you imagine yourself to be when the veil of ignorance is lifted. That's the instruction. Choose only those principles to live by, no matter what you imagine yourself to be when the veil of ignorance is lifted. In other words, there's no gambling allowed when one is choosing the principles. That is, one is not allowed to think, oh well, there's only about a 10% chance that I will be a socialist, so why don't I choose the principle of private ownership of property? Rawls doesn't allow that, because if it does turn out that when the veil of ignorance is lifted, that he finds he is a socialist, he will regret having chosen the principle. But there should be no regret once the veil is lifted. One should be able to live by what one has chosen wholeheartedly. And that's why each contractor is disallowed gambling and is told instead, choose that principle to live by, no matter what you imagine yourself to be when the veil is lifted. In that sense, the method is one of risk aversiveness, and free speech, he claimed, was a principle that would be chosen if one followed this risk-averse method. Immediately after this work was published, there was a chorus of protest by philosophers calling themselves communitarians, who claimed that there's no reason to think that someone who imagines himself to be a devout Muslim when the veil is lifted would choose free speech, since he may want to ban the book of an Indo-Anglian novelist who might one day write a book which trashes his most cherished religious feelings and values. Now, I don't want to discuss at all today this debate between communitarians and liberals. I'm not a communitarian. I mentioned this criticism of Rawls, by the communitarians rather, to lead into the notion of commitment, which I think liberalism cannot really accommodate without intolerable tension within its own doctrine. In subsequent writing, Rawls's counter to this obvious and simple objection by the communitarians was to point out that these critics were missing a crucial point in his liberal doctrine. He points out that the veil of ignorance only banishes knowledge of one's substantive values, such as to Islam or socialism or cricket. It does not banish general knowledge of human beings and their tendencies. And one tendency possessed generally by human beings is that each one of us often change our minds and revise our values. That is a general truth we know about ourselves, and this knowledge is allowed to us when we choose the principles behind the veil of ignorance. And he concludes that on this basis, of this knowledge of our tendency to revise our own views from time to time, even a person behind the veil of ignorance, who imagines that he will turn out to be a devout Muslim when the veil is lifted, would still choose the principle of liberty of speech, because he would want to protect his future, possibly revised beliefs and values, which may not include Islamic beliefs and values. In short, he would choose the principle of free speech as an insurance policy for his future revised beliefs and values that may be non-Islamic. Free speech, thus, is rational given the human tendency to revise and change our minds. Now, I think that this centrality that Rawls gives to revisability in his argument for liberal notions of free speech has a long history. John Stuart Mill had formulated a cousin of revisability in his notion of fallibility. And I, in fact, believe that Rawls's revisability is just Mill's fallibility formulated in a contractualist scenario. It is something that goes deep in liberal attitudes towards public reason and rationality. And it is this absolute centrality that liberalism gives to revisability, I would argue, that goes against the very idea of commitment in the deep sense that values such as those of Islam and socialism, etc., harbor. I won't cite cricket, because I actually think cricket lovers have basically abandoned their deep commitment to cricket since the inception of the illiterate slogging that is found in shorter versions of the game. What then is it to have deep commitments? I don't believe it is just to have a strong or intense commitment. For one thing, intensity is too vague an idea and is not really theoretically tractable. For another, one can have intense commitments that one disapproves of in oneself. I think the only serious way to theoretically characterize a deep commitment is as follows. It is a commitment that one has and one approves of in oneself, to the extent that if one ceased to have that commitment, one would be deeply disappointed in oneself. One would not really even be able to recognize oneself. So what one does is protect those commitments in us against forces that threaten them. In the way, for instance, that Ulysses did when he bound himself to the mast to protect his family values of fidelity to Penelope, when he felt they would be threatened by the sounds of the sirens. There's also this wonderful character, the Russian prince, who's a radical when he's young, and he knows that everybody, when they grow old, will lose their radicalism. So he ties himself to the mast in the same way that Ulysses did, and we do that all the time. If we are addictive smokers, we tie ourselves to the mast by making our family arrange it so that there are no cigarettes at home and so on. So this happens in trivial matters as well as in deep matters. And so here at last we can show what I think is the first limitation of liberalism, its failure to countenance the depth of commitment so understood, as I've characterized commitments, which is the only sound way, I think, to characterize what a commitment is. It's a point missed by all communitarians who stress the notion of community rather than this more abstract feature of psychology that I'm focusing on. If I'm right, notice that there's a complete impasse that faces Rawls in his argument for free speech. He had said that we must choose free speech even if we imagine ourselves behind the veil of ignorance to be devout Muslims when the veil is lifted, because of the general knowledge that is permitted behind the veil of our tendency to revise our values and beliefs. Free speech is an insurance policy that protects our future beliefs and values against our present ones. But if I'm right, and someone imagines himself behind the veil of ignorance to be a deeply committed, devout Muslim, in the sense of Ulysses that I've described, then precisely what he will seek is a principle that protects the present commitments against revised future ones. For that is what it is to have a commitment. That is what Ulysses exactly does in tying himself to the mast against future changes of mind. So the plain fact is, this is an elementary fact, that there is no greater rationality, there's no greater rationality to wanting an insurance policy for one's future revised beliefs against one's present beliefs than there is to wanting an insurance policy for one's present beliefs against future changes of mind. It is the latter that define the nature of our deepest and most fundamental commitments. Now, I want to be clear about two things. First, I'm not saying that Asghar Ali Engineer had this reason in particular that lay behind his support of the ban for Rushdie's novel. Perhaps he would find my entire argument too much of a philosopher's artifice. And second, I'm not saying that my argument shows that one should not be committed to free speech. Not at all. But what I am saying is that liberalism, in stressing fallibility, revisability, etc., as central to its doctrinal versions of liberal rationality, does not have the resources to accommodate this notion of deep commitments, such as to Islam, of the sort that were exemplified in intellectuals like Asghar Ali Engineer, whether or not my theoretical framework of the notion of commitment is what Engineer had in mind. It may well be that if we are to provide an argument for free speech that is of a piece with commitments of this kind, we would have to give up on the ism in liberalism and recover liberty outside of liberalism. That surely should be possible. There's no reason why liberalism should be granted exclusive claims to the notion of liberty. What Asghar Ali Engineer was seeking, in fact, was to salvage notions of reform and of liberty within a deep commitment to Islam. That leads to a more general question about the nature of liberty, quite apart from the particular liberty attaching to speech, which is often characterized as a negative liberty, or liberty as non-interference, rather than liberty as self-realization and self-governance. So I want to turn briefly now to another limitation of liberalism, which is its consistent and insistent and almost panicky rejection, ever since the late 18th century, of any idea of what Isaiah Berlin, a liberal Cold Warrior, if ever there was one, came to anxiously call positive liberty. panicky, constant and insistent rejection by liberals of positive liberty, an idea associated first with certain claims in Rousseau and then more explicitly in Marx, and also, as I've argued elsewhere, in Gandhi. In my work on Gandhi and on Marx, I've begun by observing that it is a very striking fact that liberal political theory of the Enlightenment never really gave any central role to the idea of overcoming alienation, in a way that both Marx and Gandhi did. It is this lack, I have argued, that lies behind the fact, and that accounts for the fact, that liberty in the liberal framework has been theorized in such a way that it is forced to be in chronic tension with liberalism's own commitment to equality. So much so that we are constantly under the zero-sum tension of being told that we can only make advances on the front of equality at the expense of retaining the advances that we've made in the realm of liberty, as the latter is understood by liberal political and economic doctrine. The rhetoric of the Cold War, with one side accusing the other of promoting equality at the cost of liberty, and the other side claiming the vice versa, is just a crude manifestation of a tension that is theoretically pervasive in the familiar framework that we have inherited from the European Enlightenment. Because he rejected both liberty and equality as bourgeois ideals, and instead invoked the ideal of overcoming alienation, that is to say, the ideal of an unalienated life, as being the most central goal of politics, Marx, I have argued, is not really a figure in the trajectory of the Enlightenment, but in a quite different trajectory of romantic thought, in which Gandhi was a much later figure, who also similarly gave no central role to liberty or equality, but instead also stressed the ideal of an unalienated life, though in his case, unlike as in Marx, its sources lay in a very unusual and heterodox religiosity. I don't have the time here to spell out the precise ways in which making the unalienated life central to our understanding of politics allows the notion of liberty that is not at odds with equality in the way that it is within the liberal framework. I've written about this at length elsewhere and I won't repeat it. But I will say this: the transformation of the notion, when it is situated in the even more fundamental ideal of an unalienated life, is plausibly described as the construction of an ideal of positive liberty that Rousseau was seeking and that some of Marx's and Gandhi's ideas made possible. I believe that the alarms that the ideal creates in liberals would be hushed if the details of this particular transformation are properly appreciated. But once that is done, it would not amount to an internal improvement within liberalism, but a transcending of liberalism and its theoretical limitations. Thus, as I said, I can't expand that here. I do want to say just a little bit about what exactly causes those alarms about positive liberty to go off in the liberal mind, so as to explore what its further limitations are. What is the source of this abiding funk on the part of liberalism regarding what Berlin called positive liberty? Notions of positive liberty are basically committed to freedom as a form of self-realization, in which one is emancipated, in some sense, by the flowering of what one's self or identity really and most deeply is. Both Marx and Gandhi describe this as a form of emancipation through an overcoming of alienation from oneself and from others in a social formation. In Marx's case, the focus was on conditions of labor in the modernity that capitalism had ushered in as the particular source of the alienation to be overcome. Whereas Gandhi, though he also focused on the harms of modernity, spoke of alienation in much more general terms, as owing to the centrality that had been given in the modern period to a scientific and intellectualizing relation to the social world, an oligarchy of expertise. That's a phrase in Gandhi. It's a remarkable phrase. Nobody, I think, and this was 50 years before Foucault, that Marx used the expression an oligarchy of expertise, which we have everywhere present. One would say it was just the tip of the iceberg of the oligarchy of expertise. And Gandhi sought to overcome it, not through a socialist revolutionary transformation, but by a sense of practical engagement through the habits and dignity of quotidian work in an unself-consciously cooperative ethos, and through acts of self-sacrificing acts of moral exemplarity. But from both Marx and Gandhi, such an overcoming would result in a form of freedom in the positive sense, a flowering of a deeper self that was not always immediately available to one's conscious understanding of oneself, at least not until its release as a result of this emancipation by the achievement of this ideal of an unalienated life. The anxiety that such a conception of freedom generates in liberalism is that it presupposes a conception of a self or an identity that we may not even be aware of. As Isaiah Berlin put it, targeting Bolshevism in his particular case. This is a quote from Berlin. You are said to be something you don't even know you are, until a Leninist vanguard, who alone knows the forward march of history, reveals your true self to you by peeling away the layers of false consciousness that protected you from knowing it, your true consciousness that is given to you objectively, whether you are aware of it or not, simply by the class to which you belong in the particular period of history you're born in. That's a quote from Berlin. Basically, it's an anxiety about objectivity. Your subjectivity is being passed off as an objectivity by those who claim to know something you don't, a theory of history, and therefore know something you are that you don't yourself know. In other words, in the name of liberty and freedom, you are being deprived of your own agency in the subjective sense by being made an object in history. The cliché in Rousseau's unblushingly paradoxical slogan, forcing you to be free, is invoked as a mantra to express this anxiety. Let's explore this anxiety with a very obvious and specific case that we are all familiar with. In any oppressed group of people in a society, whether that is understood in class terms, or caste terms, or gender terms, the claim is that there's an objective identity that this group has, which its members may not even be aware of, and they may instead be pursuing a life and values that are quite at odds with their deeper objective identity. Thus, a proletarian may be aspiring to a life of bourgeois luxury, or pursuing merely economistic demands for improved wages, but shunning all revolutionary aspirations. To make things vivid, let us say he or she is actually opposed to such aspirations and is quite explicitly committed to class docility. While oppressed Dalit is simply accepting of a caste hierarchy as an inevitable given in his life. These descriptions of false consciousness are utterly familiar to us, yet they are the site of one of the deepest issues of philosophy, because they go beyond notions of equality, which they are seemingly about on the surface, to questions of agency, which underlie them at a deeper level. And this emerges in the fact that there's a theoretical position regarding them which says that nothing in the subject's behavior reveals the true self. That's quite a remarkable claim. That what your self is, what your true self is, need never emerge in your behavior. That true self survives even the explicit denial of its existence by the subject who's said to have it. Others, the vanguard in Berlin's polemic, know one, but we don't know ourselves. And moreover, they know one better, not on the basis of one's behavior, not even on one's unconscious behavior, and so on this point Marx is more radical than Freud, it is said, since the latter at least requires unconscious behavior as revealing of oneself. Rather, they know it because they are armed with an objective account of history and each person or group's place in it. What liberalism repudiates in repudiating this picture is the methodological assumption that nothing in one's behavior is required to be the source of one's being attributed a certain self. In short, liberalism presupposes a methodological assumption of behaviorism, in some broad sense of that term, some notion of what decision theorists call revealed preferences. If one does not attribute properties to someone on the basis of their behavior, in even the broadest sense of behavior, i.e., if it is not attributed to them on the basis of what they do or say or think, or, as decision theorists would put it, their choices in betting situations, you are depriving them of their agency. Now, why do I say such a methodological assumption of liberalism is a sign of its limitations? In answer to this question, it is tempting to say something simple and intuitive, that it's preposterous to deny that a subject is oppressed, even if it acquiesces in its oppression, because its being oppressed is to be measured by standards that are objective, that go beyond what the subject may himself grasp or express in some way. Now, I think that is too simple, because it is not taking seriously at all the tug of argument from agency that the liberal is appealing to. It is openly conceding that there may be no need to rely on the oppressed subject's agency when it comes to defining what counts as oppression. But must we concede this in order to find the liberal wanting? Might there not be a more sophisticated response that shows the liberal's behavioristic outlook as crucial limitations by taking more seriously the liberals' demand that a subject not be made into an object, by taking more seriously, that is, the importance that liberalism places on a subject's agency? Here is one way we might explore such a response. Frequently in history, populations that have been acquiescent in their oppression have transformed abruptly and in very large numbers, and join movements of social and political transformation and even revolution. This could, of course, be a change of mind on their part, a change from acquiescence to dissatisfaction and revolutionary consciousness. That is how the liberal opponent of objectivism would insist on presenting it, one subjectivity being replaced by another subjectivity. But one does not have to be an objectivist to point out that both the abruptness of the transformation and the large numbers to whom this transformation sometimes happens suggests that a change of mind is not a plausible explanation, since changes of mind tend to emerge through deliberation or acculturation towards something new, processes that are both slow and proceed from small numbers of people to a larger number by a variety of accumulated efforts at public education. So a change of mind is not a feasible explanation for what needs to be explained: the abruptness of the change in a revolution and the very large numbers abruptly changing. A better explanation, indeed I would think the only explanation, of the volatility and numerical strength of such transformations is to attribute retrospectively a latent dissatisfaction in the population, even when they were explicitly acquiescent in their behavior and disavowals. Without this, there would be no explanation of the phenomenon of abruptness and the large numbers. This solution does not give up the link between agency and behavior. It simply does not require that the link be simultaneous. It may be thought that if there is this link to behavior, something of objectivity in the objectivist position is compromised, but should not be seen as a wholesale cancellation of objectivity, since objectivist positions that do not require even this minimum theoretical link with behavior and agency are in any case marred by an ulterior form of transcendence in the understanding of self and identity in the study of society and history. What both Gandhi and Marx believed in believing that revolutionary transformation is possible. Gandhi believed it as much as Marx, though he didn't believe it in socialist terms of Marx, is precisely that it allowed for the attribution of such a form of latent consciousness to explain its possibility, something liberalism simply does not have any space for, partly because liberalism is a doctrine that got formed in the articulation we have come to know it as a result of being spooked by the aftermath of two revolutionary transformations, the Jacobin aftermath of the French Revolution and the long Stalinist aftermath of the October Revolution. A spook that is everywhere evident in the orthodoxies that are reflected in Berlin's quite accurate summary of the liberal notions of freedom. Now, I believe that it is this subject of false consciousness that's never far from the surface of the contemporary emergence of what are now called populisms in different parts of the world. Though since all liberals are so angered, and often rightly angered, by such populisms, they fail to focus on the topic of false consciousness and instead see it in utterly superficial terms. So it is to this more topical variety of the limitations of liberalism to which I now finally turn. The topic of populism today has spawned an endless amount, an actually unceasing amount, of punditry in newspapers and in books and journals. And part of what makes it a complex subject today is that one needs to analyze not just the nature of populism itself, but the shortcomings of the voluminous chatter about it, since the latter contributes greatly to our inability to see through to what is fundamental in populism. In a way, the harder problem, given the incessant liberal hysteria against it, is to raise the right questions of the topic than to give answers to them. The first and obvious thing to notice about the subject is that there are distinctions to be made within populism. There's the anti-globalization populism, as for example in the United States and Britain, and there's the pro-globalization populism in countries like India, which got the present government elected and keeps it sustained. Then there's the distinction between the right-wing and left-wing populism, between on the one hand someone like Trump or Modi or Farage, and on the other the leaders on the left who are labeled and dismissed as populists, such as Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn. And the very fact that the punditry which repudiates the right-wing populists is equally dismissive of the left-wing populists is a sure sign that what populism is targeting is the liberal political establishment which this punditry represents. That left-wing populists are also strongly opposed to the populist right is no reason at all to think that they are to be wholly equated with the liberal political establishment. Indeed, I would go so far as to say that when left-wing populists are clear-eyed about what is needed and what tasks lie ahead for them, their real and most difficult enemy really is not the right-wing populists, but the liberal ideology that has accumulated over the last 3 centuries. These two distinctions within populism, pro-anti-globalization, left-right populism, do not by any means coincide. The distinctions don't coincide, since one can oppose globalization from the point of the right or the left. Yet, despite these non-coinciding distinctions within populism, it would be a sign of a lack of theoretical ambition if we fail to seek a common element in all these different populisms that these distinctions identify. But that is no easy task, since it is not at all obvious what the common element is, and what the pundits in the media and the academy have said about it is utterly shallow. One can say obvious things about the common element, such as that they all appeal to the people. But then so does democracy, and populism is different from democracy, even though it may share some properties with it. And populism is also to be distinguished from revolutionary movements that also appeal to the people. What may also rightly be said about the common element is that all populisms, however different, seek to identify an orthodoxy, or an establishment in politics and oppose it, whether it be Trump and Brexiteers opposing the congealing orthodoxy of the two parties in their countries of the last many years, or whether it is Modi's opposition to the orthodoxies of the Congress domination of Indian politics in the past and the immediately preceding decade before Narendra Modi's victory. But what is the exact nature of the orthodoxy they are opposing, and why and how are they opposing it in the form of populism, is the hard question. What is missing in the highly reactive analysis by the punditry of these movements today, analysis of these movements by the punditry today, is to seek answers to these questions. The pundits are seeking answers to these questions from the point of view, are not seeking answers to these questions from the point of view of the working people, who to a very considerable extent dominate these movements. Edward Luce, who I think was until quite recently a journalist assigned to South Asia, but is now on the American desk of the Financial Times, reported on Donald Trump's inaugural ceremony by saying this: Obama's inaugural 8 years ago radiated hope. Trump's inaugural, by contrast, channeled hatred. That's a quote from Luce. This statement is completely accurate. But in his typically shallow way, Luce proceeds, in the rest of his report, to express his hysterical liberal dislike of Trump, a dislike one may well share, even if one is not a liberal. But he does not once draw the obvious lesson from this contrast, which he has accurately presented, that the hope that was placed in Obama by working people was never fulfilled, and hence the rage. As a result, Obama comes off in the report as the figure who will be recalled by posterity as the angel who was displaced by the devil because of the prejudices of a racist, misogynist, xenophobic, white working population of the country. But there's no indication anywhere in the article of what should be obvious to anyone who looks at the contrast from the point of view of the working people among the electorate who voted for Trump, which is their perfectly sensible refusal to believe that Obama's anointed successor in the Democratic Party, nor even the orthodox core of the Republican Party, would fulfill the hopes that Obama has manifestly not fulfilled. Brexit, as we know, channeled much the same rage against Britain's political establishment. But the political establishment is not a self-standing class. Even a glance at the lineup of support for the Remain vote in Britain. If you look at the lineup of support, the roll call of support for the Remain vote in Britain, and for Clinton, both in the primaries against Sanders and against Trump in the presidential elections, if you look at the lineup of support, it shows the extent to which what underlies the political class is a parade of corporate and banking elites, ranging from the IMF, Wall Street, OECD, Soros, the governor of the Bank of England. That leads into the subject of how to understand the meaning of populism as a term of opprobrium. The term is defined by dictionaries as ordinary people's opposition to elites. So defined, it is too under-described to be a term of opprobrium. After all, democracy is intended to give ordinary people a chance to counter elites through representative politics. What populism adds to democracy is that it opposes the power of unelected officials with specific economic interests to dominate the formation of policies with the general acquiescence of the elected representatives. But this still does not capture what we instinctively recoil from in populism. How can it be wrong to oppose the voluntary, implicit surrender of sovereignty by elected lawmakers and policymakers to unelected wielders of elite financial interests? Brexit is a good example of populism to focus on to get clear about the issues that we face and also to get clear about why populism has come to mean something pejorative. The underlying issues raised by Brexit are about the working class's relation to the European Union. What prompted the larger part of the voting population to opt for Brexit? Well, I'm not going to answer that question in a short lecture, but instead I want to step back and ask a much more fundamental question about the European Union as a supranational site of political economy. Let's put ourselves in the shoes of a working or work-less person in the Thames estuary or in Liverpool. Suppose such a person were to ponder the humane policies that some nations in Europe came to embrace since the Second World War. Policies which provided safety nets, whether of health or education or housing, for people like him. He might ask, where did this happen? What was the site where these safety nets were administered and implemented? And he would answer, well, the site of the nation. He might go on and wonder, has there ever been a supranational site at which welfare was ever administered? What would a mechanism that dispensed it at a supranational site even so much as look like? Now, as Joseph Stiglitz says in his book on the European Union, there are two ways to respond to the present crisis that prompts the populist response in Europe: to withdraw from the Union or to strengthen the ties with the Union. But given these excellent questions that this worker from Liverpool is asking, why would he acquiesce in the strengthening of the links with the European Union? The worker's questions, reflecting fundamental and absolutely elementary skeptical questions that working people should generally have about the greater integration, reveal the good side of populism, the side of populism which is the opposition by ordinary people to the elites, in this case of Europe, the banking elites. Now, of course, such a person might go beyond these shrewd questions to associate supranational affiliation with immigrant hordes, who not only deprive him of economic opportunities, but dilute the centuries-long national culture of which he's so proud. But there's no logical link. There's no logical link between those excellent formal questions and these latter trumped-up anxieties. One may rightly ask the questions without having these anxieties. The linking of the two is quite confused and uncompulsory, and it's the bad side of populism. But the link is constantly made. So a question arises, whence the compulsion to make this uncompulsory link? And here we must resist the temptation to blame the people themselves. The assumption they make of such a link is not due to their feebleness of mind, but to a wide variety of distortions, not only by the media they read and watch, but by the political class, and not just the extreme elements of that class, but the political establishment quite generally. We cannot forget that the British Prime Minister, Cameron, his Remain campaign ratcheted up the immigration theme to prevent its being owned by the extreme right opposition. Just as Obama in the first campaign was far worse on immigration, just read their speeches, far worse on immigration than John McCain, again with a view to gaining ownership of a Republican platform for electoral gains. So the lesson is this: even if we identify what we recoil from in populism as the uncompulsory linking of sound questions with unsound anxieties, this cannot simply be attributed to an intrinsic incapacity in the judgment of ordinary people, but must be attributed to the failure of public education provided by the media, the universities, and the political class. One cannot believe in democracy and dismiss the electorate as vile and stupid. For the electorate is shaped by what knowledge it possesses. For 2000 years, philosophers have said that the central ethical question is, what ought we to do? Or ought we to live? But in our own complex time, the more crucial question has become, what ought we to know? And the chief point I want to make is that whatever it is that one ought to know is precisely what is either denied or masked or hidden from view in liberalism's response to populism. Indeed, there's nothing in liberalism's theoretical repertory that allows for the necessary knowledge to surface. What liberalism fails to identify, and this is really crucial to the point I want to make, what liberalism fails to identify in identifying what is wrong with populism is that it is a misinference, an illogical linking of two unconnected things. Instead, liberalism entirely focuses on the xenophobia about immigration and dismisses it wholly as a form of racism. The point is not to deny, I'm not denying, that it is xenophobic to be against immigration, as the white working people very often are in these countries. The point, rather, is that if you focus on that entirely and not see it as a false conclusion due to a flawed inference from a true premise, a premise which has to do with the inability of supranational political economies or globalization in general to speak to the needs and conditions of working and workless people, one is refusing to face up to something very deep about our present crises. It is shallow in the extreme to focus on the xenophobia on the part of a population without seeing it as something flawed, not intrinsically or not just intrinsically, but because it is a bad inference from the very good questions that they ask them about globalization and supranational sites of economy, which take away from the sovereignty of national governments to shape their future of their own people. It is this shallowness of focusing on a conclusion and not the premise and inference from the premise that yields the conclusion that reveals the limits of liberalism. I want to just stay with this abstractly made diagnosis that stresses the importance of logical links for a moment longer, so as to further expose the limitations of liberalism by looking at a case that is quite the inverse of what I've been saying, a case of liberalism's equally failing to identify a good logical inference rather than a bad one. It is a remarkable fact about liberalism today that it has become greatly exercised by the severe and dramatic environmental crisis that is faced by the entire globe. This is, of course, an entirely good thing, though I've often wondered why those who had not for decades said a single angry word about global poverty are the very people who are now all worked up about the global environment. Perhaps the answer is obvious. Climate change affects them, whereas poverty was experienced in distant lands. To be fair, I don't want to deny either that the left ignored climate change issues for a very long time because the left never really focused on future generations as a category of moral concern. But what is scandalous, what is a scandalous gap in liberal concerns about future generations and climate change in particular, is that there's nowhere any acknowledgement of the fact that this is a crisis that is simply not going to be solved unless there's an end, and I mean end, a complete terminus of capitalism. I'm not denying that socialist countries through the Cold War contribute greatly to the conditions that have created the environmental crisis that confronts us. But it is not endemic to socialism that it do so. Whereas it's the heart of capital that it will not tolerate its drive for profit being constrained in a way that could sufficiently address the environmental crisis. It is not a widely known fact that Bolivia walked out of the Copenhagen climate talks a few years ago, taking other Latin American representatives with them, declaring that there was no understanding by any of the other participants in that Copenhagen meeting that climate change could never be sufficiently addressed unless it acknowledged that the chief cause of the crisis came from global capitalism, an acknowledgement that was just simply missing in the discourse of the Copenhagen meeting and in the discourse on the environmental crisis. And it's not just world leaders in a summit who do not mention it, it's just not part of the framework of thinking in the endless hand-wringing about the environment that is pervasive in liberal circles. There is, of course, the usual hysteria about Trump and the right-wing denial of climate change. But now, let me return to my point about inferences, logical, not illogical this time, and ask you this. If P is true, and Q follows as a truth from the truth of P, is it any less rational to deny the proposition if P then Q, as it is to deny the proposition P? Or to put it in ordinary English, is it any more irrational to deny that there's a crisis of climate change that needs to be overcome than it is to deny the inference that if climate change is to be overcome, then we must transcend capitalism? I don't see that the climate change deniers are any more irrational than the liberal who accepts P, who accepts that there's a crisis to be overcome, but refuses to countenance what is absolutely necessary to overcome it. This is the same liberal fallacy, but in inverse form of the liberal response to the anti-globalization populace, condemning him for his xenophobia while refusing to see that what is most deeply wrong with the populace is not just his xenophobia, but the inference that he fallaciously draws from a sound instinct against financial globalization to his xenophobia. So it's really the failure, to focus on the proposition P rather than the inferential proposition P than Q that I think is the deep flaw to be identified. Now, why have I insisted on formulating the limits of liberalism along these abstract lines? Because I don't think we can understand contemporary populism unless we understand that it is as a result of liberalism not allowing a vocabulary of radical dissent from capitalism in its current form to be available in our political culture, that the people which populism speaks for turn to quite irrational tendencies, even including fascistic tendencies. There's a widespread instinct on our part to dismiss these tendencies as the tendencies of unreason. But I think that's a mistake. When very large sections of the population feel that the elites have set up a completely interlocked system of interests which can never be penetrated and overturned, and for which there's not even a critical vocabulary available in the mainstream of politics by which to criticize it, leave alone overturn it, then they will see the whole game as rigged and will want to kick over the whole board on which the game is being played. If that means voting for figures like Trump or Modi, so be it, they will say. If rationality as it is available in the discourse and the options available in politics is so cramped by liberalism's failure to make any radical critique of capitalism and globalization, then the people that constitutes populist movements will increasingly declare themselves to be irrational. I believe it is quite literally true that the people whom populism invokes today find it easier with the concepts available to them to conceive of the end of the world than to conceive the end of capitalism. The blame for this at least partly lies in these limits of liberalism. Thank you.